I left my wife without making a big fuss about it. I didn't take my things, didn't leave a note, and I didn't even text her. I simply packed a bag and walked out the door. It wasn't that I wanted to hurt her. It was more that I'd had enough. Our marriage had been on a slow decline for months, maybe even years. I wasn't the only one who had checked out. She had her own distractions, her own little lies. She had begun an affair a few months before, one I had found out about but never confronted her on. I couldn't bring myself to care anymore. For the first few days after I left, I stayed at a friend's place. I was numb, letting the loneliness sink in. Part of me was relieved. The silence was deafening, but it also felt like freedom. But I couldn't help but think about her. The woman I'd once loved. The woman who had betrayed me so effortlessly. It took her more than a week to realize I was gone, and when she did, it wasn't through anything obvious. I didn't return any of her calls or messages, but her first hint came when she walked into our bedroom to find it empty, the bed unslept in. Then she checked our home office, where I kept my laptop and work papers. Empty. No traces of my things left behind. She tried calling me again, and when that didn't work, she reached out to some of our mutual friends, but no one had heard from me. After the week dragged on, she finally confronted the truth. I could see the confusion in her eyes when she started to piece it together. She hadn't been paying attention to me. She had been too absorbed in her own world, in her affair with a colleague, a guy I had met a few times and always sensed something was off about. The entire time she was with him, she ignored the distance growing between us, and now it was too late. By the time she came to my apartment and knocked on my door, she wasn't angry, not at first. She was desperate, bewildered by the sudden absence. Her voice cracked when she asked what had happened, her face pale and puffy from lack of sleep. I didn't respond at first, just stared at her. I wanted to say something, to let her know how deeply she had hurt me, how her affair had broken us beyond repair. But in that moment, I simply didn't care enough. Eventually, I let her in. We sat across from each other, the space between us thick with unspoken words. I told her everything, how I knew about her affair, how I had grown numb to her neglect. I told her that I couldn't continue living a lie, pretending everything was fine when she was already so far gone. She didn't cry, at least not at first. She seemed resigned to it. Maybe she had expected this moment for a long time. She was the one who had slowly killed our marriage, after all. I told her I wasn't coming back. It was over. And with that, I closed the door behind her for good. The truth was, I had already left long before I physically walked out of our home. Days turned into weeks, and my life began to settle into a rhythm that felt more like peace than the chaos I had been living in for so long. I stayed at my friend's place for a while longer, sorting out my emotions, figuring out what I wanted next. The sense of freedom was both overwhelming and terrifying. But for the first time in years, I didn't have to second-guess every decision, every move. I didn't have to wonder where my wife was, or if she was lying to me again. Eventually, I found my own place. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was mine. The simplicity of the space, with no history or baggage, felt like a breath of fresh air. I filled it with the basics, and as time went on, started to fill it with things that made me happy, books I wanted to read, music I wanted to listen to, moments that were just for me. Meanwhile, my wife, or ex-wife now, struggled to adjust. She called me a few times, each conversation growing more desperate. At first, she begged me to come back, to give our marriage another chance. She promised things would change, that she'd end things with the other guy, that we could work through it. But I wasn't interested in any of it. I had heard her promises before, and they meant nothing to me now. As the weeks passed, she started showing up at my apartment uninvited. Each time, she had a new excuse. She wanted to talk, she had something to give me, or maybe just to ask how I was doing. I could see the cracks in her facade, the desperation in her eyes. She knew she had lost me, and nothing she could say or do would bring me back. She would leave after a few minutes, each time with a broken, defeated look on her face. One evening, she arrived again, but this time it was different. She didn't look like the woman I had married. She looked small, lost. Her eyes were red, and she was quieter than usual. She finally admitted what I had already known. She had ended things with the other man, but not for me. She did it for herself, because the affair had lost its thrill. I didn't know how to feel about that. Part of me was glad she was being honest, but another part of me felt disgusted. I let her talk, but I wasn't moved. I had moved on. It had taken me months of pain, confusion, and heartbreak to finally accept that I deserved better than a life built on lies. And in that moment, I realized I was no longer angry at her. I wasn't bitter or resentful. I just felt pity for both of us. We had spent years in a marriage that no longer existed, and now we were just two people trying to make sense of what was left. She left that night with no more promises, no more tears. The finality of it hung in the air between us, and as I closed the door behind her, I knew that was the last time we'd see each other. I don't know where she went after that. I stopped asking. But for me, the chapter was closed, and the weight I hadn't realized I was carrying finally lifted. I had left my wife, and it took her more than a week to realize it. But it wasn't the time apart that made her understand. It was a realization that I was no longer waiting for her to come back. I had already moved on. The weeks after that night were quieter than I'd ever known, but they weren't without their complexities. It felt almost like I was finally shedding layers of an identity I'd worn for too long. There were moments where I found myself reflecting on the years we had together, trying to piece together what had gone wrong. But every time I did, the clarity of why I had left hit me harder. Our marriage had been built on a fragile foundation, and once it was gone, everything else crumbled too. As time passed, I started to realize how much of myself I had lost in that relationship. My hobbies, my interests, even my own sense of purpose had been swept away in the tide of trying to salvage something that, in hindsight, had already been broken. It took leaving to find pieces of myself that I had buried, and while the process wasn't easy, it was liberating. I spent more time with friends who actually listened, who were genuinely interested in my well-being, not just as an extension of my role in a marriage. I began taking better care of myself, going to the gym, cooking meals I loved, catching up on books I'd long wanted to read. Slowly but surely, I started to heal. There was no rush. I wasn't focused on getting back into another relationship. I was simply focused on becoming the person I had forgotten I was. Meanwhile, I heard through the grapevine that she was having a hard time adjusting. Her affair partner, the one she had left me for, had ended things as well. Apparently, it had been a brief fling that had lost its excitement once it had turned into a relationship she couldn't control. The man she had clung to for validation had moved on, and with him, any illusion of happiness she had left. I didn't feel sorry for her, though. I didn't feel anything really. She had made her choices, and now she had to live with them. A few months later, I ran into her at a coffee shop. I hadn't seen her since the last time she'd come by my apartment. She looked different, less polished, more worn down. She hesitated when she saw me, but I gave her a small nod, acknowledging her presence without any real desire to engage. She came over anyway. "Hey," she said, her voice shaky, though she was trying to sound confident. I glanced up from my cup of coffee, but I didn't smile. "Hey." For a moment, neither of us spoke. It was as if we were both trying to figure out what to say after everything that had happened. After a few seconds, she sat down across from me without asking, her eyes searching my face for some sign of emotion, some hint of reconciliation. I've been doing a lot of thinking," she began, her words unsure. "I know I screwed up. I've been trying to fix things with myself, with everything, really." I looked at her, the same woman who had betrayed me, who had destroyed the life we built together. There was a part of me that wanted to tell her that I forgave her, that maybe we could find a way to move forward as friends, but I didn't. I couldn't. "Do you regret it?" she asked, her voice softer now. I thought about her question for a moment, then answered truthfully. I don't think regret is the right word. I've had to process a lot of pain, but I don't regret leaving. I needed to. For me. Her eyes flickered with something I couldn't quite place. Maybe shame, maybe understanding. She didn't speak for a long while, just sat there, lost in thought. I'm sorry, she said finally, the words not just an apology, but an acknowledgement of the depth of her actions. For everything. I wish I could go back and fix things, but I can't. I nodded, then finally allowed myself to speak. It's over. It's been over for a long time, even before I left. And I'm okay now. We sat in silence for a while longer. Two people who had once shared a life together, now strangers sitting across from each other in a coffee shop, trying to make sense of what had happened. There was no closure in the way she had probably hoped for, no grand reconciliation. But there didn't need to be. We had both moved on, in our own ways, and that was enough. When we parted ways, there were no promises of friendship or rekindled ties. She left, and I sat there for a while longer, feeling a strange peace settle over me. It wasn't anger or bitterness anymore. It was just acceptance. I had left my wife, and it took her more than a week to realize it. But the truth was that by the time she did, I had already moved past the pain. And in that moment, I realized something important. I let go, not just of her, but of everything that had held me captive for so long. I was free,